and welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones, and that number seems to be growing, Ron.
It does.
I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection.
Indeed, we do.
This week, our friend and associate, I think she's our friend, Marcia Montenegro,
the associate with us
is celebrating the Incarnation Pagan. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher, Ron Hensel, will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
But isn't everything that we like pagan, really? Okay, forget it. Okay, greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow. And now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience, but it is the Bible Buffet. Our regular legal disclaimer, thanks to our guest today, is that our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Marcia Montenegro, our friend and associate, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast. Hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again, this satirical content includes any and all commercials and credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements notice the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy this webcast, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwest.reach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant, and don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now, for our studio audience, I introduce our special guest, Marcia Montenegro.
Oh my God!
Yay! Okay.
Wow! You're so welcome. Big applause. Oh, I don't know.
They're especially
welcome now.
They're especially happy to see you too. I mean, really, you got more than most people do. So.
Oh well. So even more fake applause is better than no applause, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we used to fake applause. I used to fake it. I go, But we broke down.
It's just fake applause.
Yeah, now it's just fake.
It's just fake
applause.
Okay.
So, someone said, "Can you fake sincerity?" I said, "Sure, I can fake sincerity." Okay.
I like that.
And our disclaimer at the beginning is all a result of our friend Marcia Montenegro.
Yes, it's her fault. Yeah.
It's not my fault. Oh boy.
Well, it saves you from having to say, I have nothing to do with their humor, their satire, their jokes.
Their jokes.
I don't even have a sense of humor. No.
I do laugh at some of your jokes.
Some. Well, we had one of our guests, I forget who he was. He didn't, he wasn't laughing much, and we pointed that out, and he says, "Well, I like funny humor." And so, that's how we started the program. I think. I think he said that before we went on, when I showed a commercial or something.
Oh.
Yeah. So,
well, see, I'm not that bad.
Yeah.
No.
You're not that bad. You're just bad enough. So
just bad enough.
So here we are coming up on the Christmas holiday again, and as you are aware, Marcia and Ron, the Christmas wars have begun. If you celebrate it, you're a pagan. Yep. Okay.
Now I want to point something out here, Don. If you look at my Twitter ad Twitter X post promoting this
X, formerly known as Twitter. That's
X, formerly known, that I changed the image. You put a nice image on the website. Okay. It didn't offend me, but I have friends in the Reformed community who, when they see a creche, especially if the creche has a little Jesus in it, which this one did, they took that as idolatry. Mm-hmm. They do. And this is particularly, I'm not saying it's limited to the Reformed churches, probably isn't, but it's pronounced in certain sections of it.
Yeah.
I would, for instance, not be in favor of any image of Jesus at all being in a church, in a sanctuary,
Oh,
where it could become an object of worship, like a statue. Personally, that's where I draw the line. Okay.
what about a stained window? Because a lot of the cathedrals and some churches
Right,
I've been
right,
have beautiful
right.
stained windows. Some of them have
Yeah,
Jesus.
they're very beautiful. I like them personally from an aesthetic point of view. I would not I would not want them in my church. Now we have
Oh,
stained glass windows. They have like a cross and an open Bible, and I think
hmm
there's one with a dove. But there's no pictures of Jesus in any of them. As a former Roman Catholic, I actually know I was in a church in Chicago that not only had an image of Jesus painted on the wall, but it had an image of God the Father. And I'm thinking, how do you do that? Well, of course, that's the Sistine Chapel too, though.
Yeah, that's true. Well,
Michelangelo, but he cannot be imaged. The Father cannot be imaged, and
I
yeah,
know that, and that's the only thing is that sometimes I can look at it as art, and I'm not thinking, oh, that's what God looks like, because I know
right, right,
we
right,
don't have an image in this
right.
terms of a
See,
visual image of
I
God.
think most
But
of
I
us
can
know.
still, it doesn't
Yeah,
bother me as long as
right.
it's a
Well,
respectful image. I
right.
don't know. I don't mind pictures of Jesus in the church. I
Yeah.
I think that the graven image thing is that you are not to make idols. I think that's what
Well,
that means.
you're not to make any image, and you're not to bow down and worship it. I think that's where God
Yeah,
draws the line.
exactly.
Now,
Not to bow down
and,
and worship
and
it.
so for me, I just didn't want the hassle of because and I thought in some people's minds, here we are saying Christmas is not pagan, but in their minds, a creche is pagan. And if I were to put it
Well,
on,
and there's a lot of reasons people think it's pagan that are
well, they
all
think it's an idol, and an idol is automatically pagan. So
right,
it's
right.
a multi-step process.
There's
So,
many aspects to this discussion.
Well,
That's
oh yeah,
you just brought you just mentioned one
while
of
we're on this point, because it can be offend some. I have a friend who's a messianic believer, and he was attending a church, uh, and the church had a giant. When he walked into the foyer of the church, a giant, like I don't know, 30-foot tall painting of Jesus extending his hands, and he said, number one, it really bothers me that it's up there. We shouldn't have that kind of
iconography.
iconography, I guess it
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
on the wall. And two, it's a um, Scandinavian Jesus, and that's kind of doesn't really work either.
well, yeah. Yeah. Well, we could probably just do it. I don't know. It's almost like we could do a whole program on this, which I wasn't really prepared for. I'm more prepared for the
Yeah, no, well, we're gonna
topic
go
that
to the
we're
Christmas
supposed
one,
to
but
do. I know this is kind
since
of
Ron opened the
related, but it's
door, we
kind of
ran
getting
right
into
through.
another
Yeah,
area.
we just well, I want it for my reformed friends who might be watching this. I want to make it
Right.
also clear. I would not be in favor of a creche outside a church either. So just before you send me the hate mail, um, I, I just want to make that clear. But so I, but I'm not going to sit and judge what other churches do. I'll have my opinion about it, and don't ask me if you don't want to know. So.
No, okay, we won't. Well, I'm going to say I disagree with Ron, so
I,
I have no
I
problem
figured I would get some disagreement.
with
Let's call it pushback
just
because you push. Let's call it pushback.
pushback. Well, rather than disagreement, I don't know. Pushback
I,
always sounds so hostile to me.
I like the
People
word
use it.
pushback.
Oh, you do?
It sounds almost friendly. It sounds less
Really?
to me. I see that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
How people respond to words differently.
Yeah, I think of it as a more negative term. I usually use it in a negative way. So,
Oh, okay.
um,
I'll
but
remember that
that's
the next
okay.
time.
I'll take that if you like that better.
Oh,
Okay,
well,
I will give you pushback that I have a different view on that, and
and
I have expressed it on my
yeah, I get it.
Facebook pages when people
So
have said things about the commandment about images, and then I always say, but that means you don't make an idol. That's what he's referring to, because he's referring to the pagan cultures that they were surrounded by, where people worshiped idols. And so if it meant we can't make any image, because it says if anything on the But
right.
on the land and in the sky, that means we can't have any picture. We'll have to be like
Well,
the
yeah,
Muslims.
right. That's a
And the
Muslim.
Muslims just have geometric figures because they, drawing a frog or a star or I
Right,
don't
right.
know,
That's why I draw the line at it's
a
in the
fox,
context of worship. Yeah.
a fox, would be. Oh
Okay,
gosh,
so
I hope my
we
voice
can
gets better. A
disagree
fox or
agreeably.
whatever would be wrong,
But
which is
see, but
ridiculous.
as Paul said, when we disagree, that just shows everybody that God loves me more than he loves you. So
Well,
I forgot
okay.
what Paul said that.
If that makes you feel better, Ron.
Okay, so let's start just with a statement from Dr. Bernard Mauser as we kind of launch into this.
Oh yeah, BJ, I know him.
yeah,
Yeah,
he
He went
prefers
to
to
my
call Dr.
seminary.
BJ to you. Okay.
a good guy,
Yeah,
and
hi
he's got an
BJ.
article which we're also going to have. We have the link to in the description. How do we know Christmas is not pagan? Is the title of the article, and he poses this question or this statement. Let's look at those who celebrated the birth of Jesus in Scripture.
Right.
Before he was born, John the Baptist celebrated Jesus while in his mother's womb, Luke 1:44. Angels also praised God for Jesus, as did the shepherds, Luke 29, 2:9 through 20. The Magi also came to worship Jesus and presented him with gifts, Matthew 2:10 through 11. The Messiah was worshipped early on by the Magi. This is an indication of his deity from birth, as only God is worthy of worship. This is appropriate as what we celebrate in the Incarnation, i.e., the fact that God became man, Philippians 2:6. I think that's a
Yes,
good way to start out the whole thing.
it
Is it
is.
wrong to celebrate the Incarnation?
I have an article on my website, Christmas is Not Pagan, which prior to being on my website was a Facebook post that I did starting over 10 years ago. Every year I would post this, and every year I would have to deal with a lot of pushback, or as Ron might say, disagreement.
No, I was good.
But and and one of the things I always pointed out was the angels celebrated. The angels there were celebrating the birth of Jesus, and we have all of the instances that you cited, Don. In fact, in my article, Christmas is Not Pagan, the very beginning, I have let's look at what happened prior to the birth of Christ. And I have some quotes here, and this one I really love. It has a special meaning for me, from Luke 2:25 to 32. And this is when Simeon, I think that's how you say his name, he had been waiting to see the prophesied Messiah. He was looking for the Messiah. And he had been told by God his prayers would be answered. And he holds the infant Jesus and says, "Now, Lord, you are releasing your bondservant to depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light of revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." Which is just, to me, one of the most beautiful passages in Scripture. I heard that before I was a Christian, and it had this effect on me. I didn't know what it meant, but there was something about it that just really captivated me, even though I didn't understand the context. I didn't know who was talking. I wasn't sure what he was talking about. But there was something about the words that were very compelling to me. So after I became a Christian, and that happened within a year of being saved, when I would read this passage in this, well, I'm not going to go in the story, but I was in this group, and we would read this passage at the end of each meeting. I was not a Christian, again, let me point that out. So I didn't know what this meant. But once I became a Christian, it became more beautiful to me. And so you see right there, that beautiful passage where he's holding Jesus. He is certainly celebrating and thanking God that his prayer was answered, and he got to see the Messiah, who's going to be this light to the Gentiles and the glory of Israel. So you've got right there, very interesting, the idea that Jesus came, although he came for the Jews as their Messiah. You see the reference to the Gentiles there. Of course, that goes way back to the Old Testament when Abraham was told, that he would be a blessing to many nations. So you've got this theme picking up from the Old Testament and even mentioning the Gentiles. So right there, you have a very joyous occasion, and you have the angels celebrating, and you have John the Baptist. And so we see this joy at the Incarnation. And for somebody to say a Christian should not express joy or not celebrate it is it's because they have been unfortunately influenced by all of these false ideas coming from many cults. Of course, as you would know, especially Don, a lot of cults like the Armstrong cults,
Right.
the
Jehovah's
Hebrew Roots
Witnesses.
cults, Jehovah's Witnesses, who are all saying how pagan Christmas is, and it's so pagan. And that has just, that has seeped, and probably things coming from even the atheist side, and even pagans themselves who try to say Christians copied pagan holidays, etc. So you've got all of these voices out there trying to show that Christmas is pagan, and seemingly being able to justify that statement, although their facts are usually completely wrong. So, and then Christians are hearing all that. It's just so sad to me, because I keep asking when I post this thing about Christmas, I say, but who would not want us to celebrate Christmas? Can you think of one entity who would be very happy if we did not celebrate Christmas? Well, I can.
I can't. And in fact, he's got a whole army behind him that
Yes.
Could it be maybe Satan?
Satan and the fallen demons, fallen angels along with him. They would be thrilled with that.
Yeah, if we were just quiet at Christmas. And the other thing I want to point out while I'm thinking of it is that, think about, a lot of people say, well, they don't like it because the stores are, they're not Christian, and all these non-Christians are putting up Christmas trees, or they're singing these holiday songs. I'm like, that is wonderful. The world, even the unbelieving world, is recognizing this as a momentous occasion. Even if they don't believe, there's still, most of them still follow it and fall into what's called the Christmas season. And it always reminds me of that passage where Jesus is going into Jerusalem right before his crucifixion. And, the people are shouting out, Hosanna in the highest. And he's told, make the people be quiet. And he says, well, even if they were quiet, the very stones would cry out. So, it's like, and then we know one day it says everything on heaven and earth will bow to Jesus. So we're seeing little glimpses of that when we see the unbelieving world even celebrating Christmas. It's just, to me, it is a wonderful testament to God, to the truth of Christ. So, I have a very passionate feeling about it. I guess if you couldn't tell. So we can get into the dates too, like the December 25th thing, because that's always very.
And I think we will, but I know there's a couple of things I'd like to point out. One is, because we have dealt, as you know, extensively with people in cults, Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right. Yeah, I know you have.
And one of there's two things that I enjoy, and I really, really, really enjoy watching after they leave the watchtower and embrace the faith and they're born again. In some cases, they've never partaken of communion, for example, because that is only for the 144,000 elite. Suddenly, they're believers and they're in a church and they can partake of communion. It is for them a worshipful experience. It's pretty interesting to watch. Second is, when it comes to a holiday like this, a holy day like this, where they can worship and celebrate the incarnation in a way they never could as a Jehovah's Witness. So that's one. So you're right, and I think you touched on that with you. Second is, I want to go to 1 Corinthians for a moment on the whole issue of can you use pagan objects in celebration of the Lord?
1 Corinthians, what's your?
Well, eating meat sacrificed to idols.
Oh, okay.
Right. So
well, they didn't use eating. They didn't eat the meat in worship.
They did not eat the meat in worship, but they partook of meat offered to idols. So it was used in worship by pagans, and it was okay for Christians to partake of it, obviously not to worship it. There are those who are weak in faith who could not do that, and so you didn't want to cause them to stumble.
Right.
But the case being weak in faith. So what I find is many of those who are engaged in trying to say you cannot celebrate Christmas because at some point it had pagan attachments haven't really thought that through, because what they're basically saying is, I'm so weak in faith that I can't. I'm afraid I will start worshiping paganism if you celebrate Christmas.
And it wasn't as though we took the feast of Saturnalia and made it into Christmas. That never happened. It never happened.
That's the more important part.
In fact, the feast of Saturnalia was celebrated from. It came later than the birth of Christ.
Right.
And it was celebrated from, I think it was December 17th to the 23rd, which, of course, we all know December 23rd is Festivus. So if anything has a connection to Saturnalia, it would be Festivus. So Festivus for the rest of us is Saturnalia for the whatever. Okay, so and it wasn't it. And usually you hear this narrative that Saturnalia was this festival of debauchery and criminality. No, it wasn't. That's all made up. It was nothing like that. I think the only thing that we would find a little bit questionable was gambling was temporarily legal. That was about it. That was about it. Pretty much everything else was just a typical, ordinary pagan festival. You sacrificed to the idols. You ate a lot of food. Oh, one thing that they did was masters served their slaves dinner. They served them at the table. The role was temporarily reversed between slave and master.
That's kind of cool.
What? How can let's object to that today, right? So anyways, it's all trumped up, and the fact of the matter is that we have textual evidence that December 25th was considered the birth of Christ as early as the early 3rd century.
Right.
Yes.
Hippolytus of Rome is probably the earliest. Chrysostom comes later, and by that time, it had become a festival in the church. And apparently it didn't spread uniformly throughout the Roman world, the Christian world at that time, but it was observed here and there, and it kind of grew, and there was no association whatsoever. When you read the authors, you have basically Hippolytus, Chrysostom, and Jerome all talk about it, and they pin the date. Guess where? Each one of these guys pins it where? December 25th.
Yes, and to follow up on that, thank you for that, all that, because I've read all that, but I can't always remember it like you just expressed it. So I'm glad that you can say
I'm looking at my annual Christmas presentation.
I do have some stuff up here to look at too, because I just can't remember all these dates, names, and things. But one of the things is that also I read that at that time, the early Christians were so intent on separating themselves from paganism, they would not have taken anything pagan and tried to make it Christian.
No.
They were not trying to say, oh, this is a pagan feast here, we're going to make that the honor.
No.
That would have been the last thing they would have done. They were very sensitive to that.
Especially in the time of Hippolytus of Rome. I mean, people try to make the argument that everything changed with Constantine. That
Yeah.
he's the guy who kind of opened the door for all this paganism. Well, Hippolytus was dead 100 years before the Council of Nicaea, or maybe a little less, but he was dead at the beginning of the previous century, near the beginning of the previous century.
Right.
So he wasn't living at a time when they wouldn't have considered that at all. No.
Right. That was not an idea at all. And there are two different theories about, well, there's actually stories of how they came up with it. So December 25th, there was a kind of a tradition at the time that the date of the death of the martyr would be the date of their conception. And so March 25th was the date of, from what I read, was the date calculated to be the day of the crucifixion of Jesus. And that is 9 months before December 25th. And the other thing that I've read, which actually I think I've read more this than that idea, but I haven't read all of the material on this, is that they took it from the date of service in the temple of Zacharias, John the Baptist's father, because John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus. So he ends his service at the temple. He's told his wife is going to conceive. They usually take that as happening like almost immediately after that. And and because of the service of dates in the temple were set out in this regular pattern, people said that you could figure when that was, and then 6 months, then not 6 months, but then John the Baptist is born, but he's 6 months older than Jesus. So without going into all the math, which I can't do anyway, and if I try, it's going to sound terrible. Anyway, if you go find those articles, they'll explain it better. And so those are two different ways to arrive at December 25th. But at the same time, we are not, I don't think any of us here are saying we are 100% positive that December 25th is the date of Jesus' birth. Right. And furthermore, I don't think any of us really think it matters that much. It's just that that's the date that kind of came about from early Christians, from the early church. And why not? I mean, I wouldn't care if they had come up with, May 17th as the date. That would be fine. Then I would celebrate the birth of Christ on May 17th. I don't really care what day it is. But that's the date that they came up with. And that's, whether it's the date or not doesn't matter. I don't think God expects us to try to figure out the date that Jesus was born. So, it's that's irrelevant. So people have so many objections. They object to like, well, why December 25th? How do you know that was the date? And then, have to explain, well, this is why, this is how it came about. We don't know for sure, but that's the date that's been used for a long time. I'm not prepared to suddenly pick another date for Christmas. Anyway, so there's several factors and principles that are involved in this idea.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right. We don't have a birth certificate from the barn in in Bethlehem where he was born. Didn't do that.
Well, they could, I think I saw one in PDF form though once. It looked like it was a modern thing, and I kind of question whether it really went back to.
Well,
they're trying to solve the
Abraham Lincoln did say that you can't trust anything you found on the internet.
Right, he did. Be very careful. Mm-hmm.
Oh my! All right, so you're right. In fact, one of the things that Mauser also points out is that the stake was already in use 100 years before Saturnalia even came in. So,
well, I actually, I wouldn't say that. I think there might have been. Well, Hippolytus dies in, I think it was 8235, and I think they've traced Saturnalia to maybe around the time Hippolytus was a young man. So it comes into play maybe 100 years or so after the birth of Christ, maybe more than 100 years. But the date of December 25th is in no way associated. I mean, like I said, the dates are just wrong. They're in the same month, but they're the wrong. It's the wrong. It's the wrong date. So they didn't. There's no, and to think that an early third century, late second, early third century Christian writer would deliberately adopt a pagan day is like so absurd. It's just beyond. You don't even have to argue this. It's just say when he lived, because Constantine wasn't even born yet when this happened.
Right.
And this article has an interesting thing about Hanukkah, that the Jews always mark the 25th day of the winter month of Kislev as the start of the 8-day feast of Hanukkah, but they no longer had access to the Jewish lunar calendar, having been put out of the synagogue.
Oh, that's nonsense.
Huh?
That makes me laugh. They no longer had access to. Everybody was using it in Palestine. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, they says they simply observed the 25th day of the month that most closely aligned with the winter month of Kislev.
Who's writing this, by the way?
And that month is December, huh?
Is this somebody arguing against Christmas? Or
no, they're for Christmas.
Okay. I would say, yeah. I would say
this article is very detailed. It gives a lot of different. It has a lot of different information about the date, the 25th.
I'd want to be really careful about saying somebody didn't have access to the Jewish lunar calendar.
Oh, okay.
It's like, what does that mean? I mean, if you had a Jewish friend, he could tell you. Just ask him, what day is it on the Jewish?
Well, these are believers. They're believers, and they probably, the Jews who were. I don't know if they were they able to associate with the Jews anymore once they followed Christ?
Well, yeah, they were. Well, they would have. We don't know what percentage of the church remained Jewish into the second and third centuries, but they were there. We know that. And if they were raised Jewish, and we know that there was freedom, of discourse, if you will, conversation between Christians and Jews. We have the dialogue with Trypho, where Justin Martyr is carrying on a conversation with a Jewish person. So it wasn't as though they didn't talk to each other. They would have been aware. These two cultures living side by side, you would have known when your Jewish neighbor was celebrating something.
I think what he might be saying is that what he says is Christians of Jewish ancestry in ancient Rome, December 25th became the significant importance as the beginning of the festival of dedication, in which Jews remember the light that came into the second temple after the Maccabean Revolution, in other words, Hanukkah, which Jesus apparently observed. That's in John 10:22-23. So, and that's when Jesus said, "I'm the light of the world." Interestingly enough, he said that at the beginning or during that festival in John 10, which refers to Hanukkah, although it doesn't use the name Hanukkah. So there, what he's doing is saying that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but he's saying that was tied into Hanukkah. And
well, it could, here's the strength of that argument is that we would have been the Romans were using the Julian calendar.
Right.
And
he mentions that.
And right now there's a 13-day gap between what the Julian calendar was when they started switching to the Gregorian calendar. That was 1582. But back then there was only an 11-day gap. They had to jump 11 days to switch. But now, if you look at the date of Christmas or Easter, or the date of Christmas in particular, on a Greek Orthodox calendar, there's a 13-day gap. So the gap keeps getting wider, which means as you go back from 1582 to the first century, it would have been even wider. So December 25th could have occurred 3 weeks or more earlier in the solar year than it does today. So yeah, I think, we go back 1,500 years, maybe December 25th came before Hanukkah. You'd have to sit down with somebody who's really familiar with both calendars, neither of which we use. We only use the Gregorian, but it's an interesting idea. 1,500 years is a long time.
Way too much work for me. But here's one thing that we know.
complicated for me. That would
Yeah.
that just burns all the brain.
Well, here's one thing that we know is
My brain cells were like burning out as you were talking.
well, one thing that we know is that some folks like to find reasons to kind of pour water on your parade. Some just like to pick and choose doctrinal issues that are heretical, and one of our sponsors deals exactly with that.
Yeah. So we have some questions. Are you tired of hearing all about the difference between the milk of the word and the meat of the word? Are you wondering when your church is going to get around to serving the ice cream and cheesecake of the word? Does your pastor take that whole Bible thing way too seriously? Well, then you need to check out the Bible Buffet. Everything at the Bible Buffet is prepared with your comfort and enjoyment in view. Everything there is gluten-free, trans-fat-free, and truth claim-free. And all of their dishes are piping hot and ready to eat. And even when the latest 15th round of COVID starts rolling through, they're always open thanks to Bible Buffet Carryout. This week's regular Sunday specials include Aryan appetizers, Sabellian succotash, Galatian goulash, Gnostic nut salad, Pelagian pie, and Socinian salad. And don't forget, the Bible Buffet is a fully accredited ministry of the Church of Smorgasbordianism. The Bible Buffet, it's not your father's worship experience, but it should be yours. And you should check it out, Marcia. I think,
I know that Gnostic nut salad sounds good.
Yeah. You know some Gnostic nuts that you'd like to share with?
I've known a few.
How funny.
So when people talk about, I think Saturnalia is the main thing that comes up when people talk about.
That's one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to point out that I am not one of those who believes that Constantine was the one who opened the door to paganism in the church. But that's he's the usual scapegoat.
Yeah.
So, but they usually cite another argument that comes up is the word Christmas, because it includes the idea of it includes the word mass.
Yes, I have had that objection as well.
And the problem with that is that at the time the word was coined in English, and by the way, there are only two languages on earth that use Christ plus mass. That's English and Dutch. Christmas and Kerstmis. Those are the only two.
Oh.
Every other language is like Navidad, Weihnachten.
Yes.
They have nothing. Most of them, in fact, only one other language has the word Christ in it, and that's Greek, Christougena. So every other language takes Christ out of Christmas.
Yeah.
Literally every other one. And so it's like, don't complain to me about how we take Christ out of Christmas with abbreviating it with the Greek letter key. But when the mass became part of the word in English, well, English didn't even exist until about 435. Didn't even exist as a language. And the doctrine of the mass, where we have transubstantiation and the doctrine of the sacrifice of the mass, that didn't really become official until 1200. So mass, what was mass? Why did they use that word? Well, it's a Latin word that means dismissal. It comes from a Latin phrase which reads, I'm going to come up with it here, ite missa est. You are dismissed. At the end of the worship service in the ancient Latin-speaking churches, you come to the end, they say ite missa est, and missa becomes the word mass, meaning dismissal. Why would you call your entire worship service by the name of one of the last words uttered in it? I don't have a good answer for that. There's some theories, such as one theory is that, you know how churches have those signs over the exit saying you are now entering the mission field?
Yep. My
Well,
church had that.
Yeah, well, the word missa, some people say, was connected to missio, meaning mission. So there's this kind of play on words,
Yeah.
You're dismissed to go and preach the gospel. That's actually a theory. It's not supported by everybody, but so we don't really know exactly why that became the name for the worship service, but we do know that it had nothing to do with transubstantiation. It had nothing to do with
Right.
worshiping the host or anything like that. Nothing. So it's just kind of one of those happenstances of linguistics that in two languages, only two, the word for the worship service, not the later mass, the worship service was, in other words, this is the day we worship and celebrate Christ's birth. That's all it meant.
Okay.
That's good. That's interesting. Thanks, Ron, for that information.
What about the claim by some that, in fact, I go back just briefly to a debate I had. House Church asked me to come in and debate. They had an atheist that was a neighbor, and his starting premise was the 13 or 18 Jesuses of history. And he lays out all of these supposedly virgin-born, crucified, resurrected characters in history. So I listened to him carefully, and I suggested when it was my turn to respond, I said, well, before I respond to your claims, let me point out one thing, that just because there are this many claims that you're enumerating doesn't mean that a Jesus didn't actually exist, who was born of a virgin, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Why'd you have to go spoil everything with logic, Don?
I know. So your case doesn't dispute that Jesus actually lived. And then we went on to discuss the claims about the others. And that comes into play here. What about Mithra, Adonis, Osiris, Dionysus?
There's a bunch of great YouTube videos that responds to each of those. Each of them. It takes each one and shows how they are not like Christ at all, and that Christ could not have been copied from them. I think the cult of Mithras like later. It was like in the was it the 3rd century or something, or I don't know. It was later than Christ. It was not. It wasn't. So Christ could not have been copied from that. Because
I'd have to go find it now, because I don't really keep my cult of Mithras notes right on my desk.
There's some good videos on it.
One of the ones I really like, and I think Marcia has on her website as well, is Lutheran satire.
Oh yeah, now I've posted that on Facebook many times. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's short. It's under 5 minutes, and it kind of defeats all of these Horus and Mithras and in the form I like best, satire.
Yeah.
Well, that's the only truly intellectual format. Yeah. I don't see how people can actually think without satire myself, but according to Wikipedia, which of course we know its reputation for solid information, Mithras was pretty much, it started sometime in the 1st century. So, Jesus was born maybe just prior to the 1st century. So yeah,
and a lot apparently which is what I read is that the cult of Mithras, as well as a few others, tried to they wanted to blot out Christianity, so they actually were imitating Christian stuff and making claims that about that looked like Christian claims, because they were trying to stamp out Christianity. So it's the other way around. The pagans copied the Christians.
Gee, if you think anybody who would have a motive to do something like that again?
Yeah, who would want to stamp out Christianity? Let me think. Yeah. So, it's the pagans who were trying to imitate the Christians in some cases. So a lot of people, they, like I said earlier, they hear this stuff, and unfortunately, it's all over the internet. All you have to do is, put Christmas or celebration of Christmas or something in Google, and a million sites will come up with all this false information, much more than the few out there who are actually giving facts. I think more people are now. I've noticed in the last few years, last 3 or 4 years, there's been more videos on Christmas and how it's not pagan. It wasn't started by pagans. And even Christmas trees were first used by Christians. They were first used probably in Estonia in the 13th or 14th centuries. Some think it was Lithuania, I think in the 15th, 14th or 15th, 1 century later.
I heard they were really popularized by a Lutheran princess in Germany, maybe a century or two later. So maybe they already existed, and she just thought, hey, this is, I need some special, home decor for the holidays, and she brought them in.
Yeah, I think because at first they were called paradise trees, and they were they were reminiscent of the tree of life, I believe in the Garden of Eden. They were called paradise trees, and they were actually hung upside down or something, or initially with apples or something on them.
Well, people would kiss. I hear people.
Article I read on that has been a while.
Would people kiss under them when they were hung upside down?
No, I don't.
And they kept falling on people. So they said, maybe we should just put a little mistletoe.
That would also help to keep the cats from knocking them over.
Well, that's true. It worked for cats. That must be why they did it. So they were like suspended or something. They weren't. It wasn't like the way we see them now. But the idea for the tree and everything did not, come from pagans. And yes, pagans do. There are pagan worshipers of tree. The Druids are known for that. Trees are very sacred. Were sacred to the Druid cults and the neo-pagan Druids today. But that's not where it came from. That's not what Christians didn't say. Oh, look, the Druids are worshiping the tree, so we're going to take a tree and make it a Christmas tree. It just did not happen like that. And that's another thing. And let me mention in connection to the tree, the Jeremiah 10 passage. So many
right.
Whenever I put my post up on Christmas, people put Jeremiah 10 or they quote a section of it. If you read Jeremiah 10, which is not very long, clearly it's talking about cutting down trees to carve idols from the wood.
It's pretty clear.
And you decorate the wood with silver and gold, and you make an idol to worship a false god.
And they're talking about carving the idol and and basically coating it with a coating of so they'll melt the silver and the gold. Or gold, pure silver, pure gold was so soft you could mold it with your hands. Sometimes you'd warm it up.
Right. And that's what Jeremiah 10 is talking about. It's a denouncement of idol worship. And so it has nothing to do with trees or decorating trees, putting ornaments on trees, which is what people tried to make it seem. Of course, this is before the birth of Christ, so I don't know why people would be decorating trees with ornaments then. But they try to tie it into that. And you can't. If you read that passage, that's not what it is. So there's nothing against using a Christmas tree, for Christmas. It's in fact, decorating it with ornaments and thinking of the birth of Christ and being joyous about the birth of Christ it can be a wonderful time for a family or for, Christians decorating a tree at the church or whatever, the fellowship. It is not. And of course, who created trees?
I have a theory about that.
Yeah, let's see. Let me see. It's another question we have to ponder here. Who created trees? So, the tree belongs to God. The tree belongs to God, and we can use God's tree to honor Christ. So there you go. I want so much for Christians who are, enjoy Christmas and have enjoyed them, and who are hearing these stories and tales, to not feel guilty about celebrating Christmas. This is just horrible that some Christians start to wonder and doubt. I mean, I did as a new believer when I was a new Christian. Here I am, saved out of the New Age, saved out of being a professional astrologer, out of all of my New Age stuff, belief in reincarnation, spirit guides, the whole shebang. I'm saved out of that by God's grace and mercy. And I start feeling guilty about celebrating Christmas. And I was a single mother and I had a young son, and I didn't want to not do it because I thought that would be too strange for him. So I'm doing my tree and I'm feeling sort of guilty because I'd heard it was pagan.
Right.
And I'm not enjoying it. I'm not able to really have the joy of the Lord on Christmas because of all these stupid lies out there.
Yeah. It's like,
I get very angry. It makes me very, very angry because I don't want other people to have the same experience I did.
when I was, I would, goes back 25 years more because we hadn't adopted Ben yet, but I would have Jehovah's Witnesses in my house, and they came over one time when we had our Christmas tree up, and of course they were trying to convert us and all that. And we got into it a little bit. I think they were trying to avoid the subject because they could see our Christmas tree, and they thought, we better save this one for later. They didn't know I already knew, and we started talking about whether we should tell our son or whoever. We were pretty sure we were going to get a boy from Korea, right? Tell them about Christmas, and it was like, of all the things, the worst thing we could do was even mention Santa Claus to a child. Oh no, don't do that to him. It's like
Yeah.
And it's like, I just thought, oh, come on. It's like they're children. And I remember when I found out Santa Claus wasn't real, it was not an earth-shattering experience.
It wasn't for me either.
I think I was starting to
okay.
I was starting to piece it together. It's like, wait a minute here.
That's how I did it.
We don't even have a chimney in our house. I don't think so. How did he get in?
Just as a side note, unrelated to any of this, just watch how differently culture is from don't tell them there's a Santa to don't tell them they're a boy or a girl.
Yeah. So my son, we he got gifts in my wife's family tradition. She would get gifts from her parents, but then she would get additional gifts from her parents that said from Santa.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think what that was about, we didn't do that in my family. The gifts just miraculously appeared under the Christmas tree, and we went down there and we figured it out. Well, anyways, the Santa gifts were the ones that weren't on the Christmas list, but they got extra, So Ben started getting those, and by the time he was like 5, he'd figured out that, Santa wasn't real. We didn't even have to tell him, So it's like, kids are smarter than you give them credit for.
Yeah, they kind of, and I think most of them enjoy, now some Christian parents I've seen them comment on Facebook, I am not going to tell, or we don't tell our child about Santa because we don't lie to our child. You get into like maybe a difficult topic to discuss here, but I do consider that a falsehood. It's true. There is not a real Santa Claus at the North Pole. Mythically, there's a Santa. I guess you could say there's sort of a myth of Santa. And now when my son was, when I became a Christian, my son already knew there was no Santa. He was 9 years old. So he had kind of realized that, I don't know when, maybe 2 years earlier or something, before I became a Christian. So I didn't have to go through the whole thing of, should I tell my child about Santa or not? I didn't have to deal with that as a Christian. But I think that I probably would, because I would see it as I might tell the child Santa's not real, but I would not see any harm in kind of having Santa Claus as out there in the culture. I don't know that I would actively do anything like have a statue of Santa Claus in my home or something.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not really. And Santa Claus is based on Saint Nicholas.
Right. And once I heard that at the Council of Nicaea, the real Saint Nicholas went up and punched Arius in the mouth. I mean, he was in my book. As far as I was concerned, we're gonna celebrate this guy all the time.
I've heard that isn't true. That's not necessarily.
Yeah, I hear
that's kind of a.
It might have just been a little slap. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't care. He was upset.
It's kind of it's a good story that he.
It's good enough for me. Good enough for me, right?
So,
Yeah.
that is kind of an issue. I guess parents have to decide on their own, but I don't think you have to be anti Santa Claus. If you don't want to tell your child about Santa, then okay, you just tell
Well,
them.
and the
Santa's a
focus,
made up guy, but he's based on a real person, St. Nicholas.
Right.
And so people, the culture in general celebrates the Santa Claus guy. I think it originally comes from the Dutch, from Holland, because I mean, and then the Holland, because the name is very much like Santa Claus. I
Well,
have
it's a shortened form of Saint Nicholas, really. Now in French, it's Père Noël, Father Christmas.
right, but
Uh,
the Santa Claus comes from the Dutch term for Santa Claus, which is based on Saint Nicholas.
yeah,
So I've forgotten how the words go, how they change, but
I
the
could
Saint
look it up.
Nicholas
well,
story, he
and,
got a
and,
name in the Netherlands that sounds like Santa Claus, and then anglicized into Santa Claus, the way we use the term
I
here.
think just to kind of interrupt this one thing here, because I think in some ways that becomes a distraction from the central theme of what the celebration is to be about.
Yeah,
We all, many of us, can get caught up into this and bringing Santa in, buying the presents, getting a tree. All that stuff adds to the ambiance, perhaps. But what is the central theme and purpose
right.
of the celebration?
And I think the real Saint Nicholas
Incarnation.
would want us to focus on Christ, obviously.
Yes. Yeah, and Christ, yes, should be the focus, of course, and it should not be presents or Santa Claus or the reindeer or whatever. It needs to be the celebration of the incarnation of Christ and why Christ came, why God sent Jesus, and Jesus says over and over again in the Gospel of John, my Father sent me. I was sent by my Father. There's so many times he says it. I remember once I started circling it and started to count it up, and I finally stopped because it was so many times. I don't know. I just didn't have the time to finish going through the whole Gospel of John, circling the word sent. And my Father sent me, and I come from my Father, and my Father from above sent me. This is over and over again in John, the Gospel of John. And of course, Jesus came also of his own will. So that is an important thing to remember. I think that's a good theme to think about at Christmas time, that there was a harmony in the Trinity, of course, as there always is. And it was the will of the Trinitarian God that Jesus would come to earth. And Jesus, of course, knew what he was here for and what the end would be like for him, which, of course, was on the cross. So that cross is, the shadow of the cross is on Christmas. But that's a good way to think of it, because of course that's why we are saved, is because of the cross and because Jesus came and died on the cross. So it's so central to just being a Christian, the whole the incarnation and the life and the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. They're just all central to being a Christian, to our
Right.
faith.
Well, Sukoko said, and we put this up before, new believer here. Thank you. I needed to hear this. Heart, heart, heart. We're glad for that. Glad you're with us.
Yes, I'm so glad. Thank you for letting us know that.
Yeah,
That's
and
very encouraging.
Krista Matthias earlier said, disclaimer is great.
Well, we did it. We did it for Marcia. Marcia.
Marcia. So it has a story. Well, I'm glad you joined us again. Your articles are linked in the description, and I will also be adding Dr. Mauser's in there as well.
Good.
And every year about this time, we try to do something on this topic because it is terribly misunderstood, I think, by so many.
And if you get a chance, go to YouTube. I haven't played this yet, but one of my favorite Christmas songs is one that hardly anybody's heard. It's called "Christmas Song for All Year Round" by Randy Stonehill. Came out on his first album back like in the 70s, and he mentions St. Nicholas, and he says, "I'm sure that if St. Nicholas were here, he'd agree that Jesus gave the greatest gift of all to you and me." So I highly recommend that song. And that's about it.
Marcia,
Okay.
thank you for being with us and hang on for a minute afterwards. Ron, would you walk us out of here?
Yes, let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Kneel Before Me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gomez. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Joe Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew LeBlanc. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law. If it happens, you'll be the first.
Never happens. All right, all. See you all next.
Hasta
Not
luego.
next week.
No, we're off next